Due to her age, Maria Gonzala hadn't celebrated her own birthday in a long time. The lady's husband had passed away 10 years ago, and it was an extremely painful loss for her. Since then, time seemed to stand still for Mrs. Gonzala, and as if by magic, she stopped receiving visitors. She barely received calls from her friends. "I guess this is what being neglected feels like," thought Mrs. Gonzala sadly. Deep down, the woman didn't feel like an elderly person, therefore, she didn't like her new status of being lonely. But that day was special for Mrs. Gonzala. After all, it's not every day that you turn 80. It's an impressive age to reach, definitely a reason for celebration. That morning, Mrs. Gonzala got up earlier than usual. Of course, she wasn't hosting a big party with family, basically, she just wanted to make the day special for herself. She wished for a chicken pie and cooked her potatoes. "Well, that looks very good," said Mrs. Gonzala after examining the results of her own work with a smile. But before she had time to set the dishes on the table, the doorbell rang, and she wondered who it could be. Mrs. Gonzala opened the door and gasped in surprise. Her grandsons, Tiago and Bruno, were standing at her doorstep. "They must have come to celebrate my birthday with me," Maria Gonzala thought cheerfully. "Hi, Grandma, what delicious smell is this? Are you expecting guests, or is this some kind of celebration?" Bruno said. Gonzala lowered her eyes and invited her grandsons into the kitchen. The poor woman secretly believed that her grandsons remembered her birthday and brought to celebrate with her, but the truth wasn't as cheerful. Meanwhile, Tiago and Bruno walked around the house as if they owned the place, examining the living room and then the bedrooms. Moreover, they wrote something in a notebook and silently discussed all the pros and cons of the house. It was only when they reached the kitchen and saw the pie on the table that they remembered it was Grandma's 80th birthday. "Congratulations, Grandma, it smells so good," Tiago exclaimed and sat down at the table without ceremony. A minute later, he and his brother were already devouring a delicious pie. At that moment, Mrs. Gonzala realized that she had helped raise her grandsons. Unfortunately, when Tiago and Bruno grew up, they practically stopped visiting their grandmother, and now they didn't really come to celebrate her birthday. The purpose of their visit was very simple. They had their eyes on Mrs. Gonzala's house and even found a buyer for it. The old lady knew nothing about it and thought her grandsons simply decided to renovate the house. But when the pie was finished, Tiago exchanged a glance with Bruno, after which he said, "Well, Grandma, pack your things because I need to pack mine." "I wasn't planning on going anywhere today," the old lady exclaimed, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Because we're taking you where you've always wanted to go," Tiago replied evasively. Mrs. Gonzala began to gather her things while the boys continued to inspect the house. The longer the grandsons spent, Tiago and Bruno were already mentally counting the money they would receive for the house and thinking about what they would spend it on. Having packed her things into a small suitcase, Mrs. Gonzala had no idea where her grandsons would take her. She suspected that Tiago and Bruno might have bought her a smaller house for a comfortable and easier life. She had long dreamed of a small house in a village. Therefore, when the grandsons started talking about moving, the old lady assumed they had decided to fulfill her dream. And she made the mistake of going with them. 5 minutes later, the three of them were already heading in an unknown direction. The grandsons just nodded, not saying a single word on their way, only exchanging meaningful looks with each other. Why are they being so mysterious? They must have prepared a surprise for me, Maria Gonzala thought with a smile. But when Tiago and Bruno took her to a discreet building outside the city, her heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Gonzala had never been to this place, but when she looked at it, she saw something that made her heart beat eagerly. The woman was surprised to see a group of elderly people dressed in identical clothes. They were strolling in a small courtyard in front of the building. Some of them could walk around the room, while others needed a cane. "Well, Grandma, this is your new home," Bruno said, opening the door. At that moment, it became obvious that the grandsons had taken Mrs. Gonzala to a nursing home to sell her house and split the profits. It was Bruno who had been thinking about it for a long time. The director of the nursing home welcomed them at the entrance. In fact, he was in on the boys' plan. "Don't worry, Grandma, you'll like it here," they spoke, as if they were doing something casual. Throughout all this time, Maria Gonzala didn't say a single word. The woman was shocked at her grandson's cruelty on her birthday. Of course, she understood they did it because they needed the money, but she had already helped them in every way they could. Mrs. Gonzala gave them money to buy cars, she paid for their college, and now, instead of being grateful to her, they brought her to live out her days in a nursing home. At first, Dona Gonzala was very anxious and could hardly sleep at night, but she soon got used to it and even found some advantages in her living situation. Maria Gonzala was no longer alone and could spend time with other seniors like herself. Meanwhile, Bruno and Tiago were sitting in a restaurant celebrating the successful sale of their grandmother's house. "We should bring something for Grandma, maybe some fruits," Tiago said. "Okay, I'll think of something," Bruno replied. The next day, the young businessman turned to his old college friend with a request. Guilherme was Bruno's colleague. They worked in the office of a trading company. Unlike Bruno, Guilherme was a responsible and reliable employee who didn't allow himself to slack off at work and blame others. Therefore, when Bruno approached him with such a request, the man should have immediately realized something was wrong, but he couldn't say no to his colleague, especially because Bruno asked him to bring fruits and some groceries for an elderly lady. In return, the grandson from the house would give fruits to his grandmother and wouldn't even go personally. He would send his friend Guilherme. Raised in an orphanage, Guilherme valued family more than anything else in the world. Therefore, he simply couldn't comprehend how someone could put their own grandmother in a nursing home and continue with their life, as if nothing had happened. When Maria Gonzala was informed that she had a visitor waiting for her, the elderly woman was ecstatic. "It's probably Tiago or Bruno, at least they found time to pay me a visit," she thought, but then saw a young stranger. Gonzala really didn't know how to react, understanding how strange Miss Gonzala must have felt. Guilherme immediately explained what was happening and hurried to change the subject of the conversation to her genuine amazement. Dona Gonzala became so engrossed in the conversation with the young man that she didn't see how long they had been talking, showing genuine interest in her life. Guilherme captivated the elderly woman from the first minutes of the conversation, but most importantly, the young man wasn't pretending and therefore was behaving so naturally. At the end of the visit, Guilherme promised to come back. Naturally, Mrs. Gonzala didn't really believe he would keep his promise, so when Guilherme returned the next morning, she was very surprised, but also genuinely happy. Since then, Guilherme had been visiting Mrs. Gonzala almost every day, showing touching concern for her health and mood. Eventually, the staff at the nursing home began to call him Mrs. Gonzalez's grandson, not knowing that the two were not actually related. Time passed, and Mrs. Gonzalez became increasingly attached to Guilherme. It is worth noting that during this time, Bruno and Tiago never bothered to make a visit to their grandmother. Furthermore, they never called her, unfortunately. Despite Guilherme's care and the help of the nursing home staff, Mrs. Gonzalez's health began to deteriorate rapidly in the fall. Realizing that her time was coming, the elderly woman began to talk to Guilherme about what he wanted to achieve in life. Actually, I dream of opening a sports center for children. I would let any child in for this, so that orphans and children from dysfunctional families would play sports instead of wandering the streets aimlessly. I would have done it already, but I don't have the money. But that's okay, maybe I'll save up enough when I get old, was Guilherme's response. She asked the young man to come closer and sit in silence. I can't help you open a sports center, but I can give you some sports equipment. I inherited an old garage from my husband, and there's all kinds of junk there, rusty tools of all sorts. But there's also a gym weight in there. It weighs 25 kilograms, my husband used it when he was younger. Keep the whole garage, but I insist you keep this weight, it's quite special. She then let out a mysterious laugh. You know what I'm talking about, she said. Of course, I do, I've been practicing sports since childhood, Guilherme replied. At that moment, the young man couldn't even imagine what kind of surprise Maria Gonzalez had prepared for him. Having taken the garage key, Guilherme went to fulfill the old woman's wish without any hidden agenda. He found various things that were very old, but when the man decided to do some simple exercises with such weight, he could hardly lift it off the ground. And this, despite the fact that Guilherme worked out regularly. Obviously, there was something wrong with the weight. The young man was sure it weighed much more than 25 kilograms. Guilherme looked at it from different angles, turned it over, but the mystery remained unsolved. Everything became clear a little later when Guilherme decided to dust it off. That was when the man caught a glimpse of a noble yellow color. Dear God, this is gold, Guilherme exclaimed, almost fainting. The fact was that it was not just an ordinary gym weight. It was made of the purest gold. This weight with a golden secret had been passed down from generation to generation and was made by Maria Gonzalez's great-grandfather, who was known as a wealthy landowner. And now, this treasure had been passed on to Guilherme, who could hardly carry the weight home. The man rushed to the nursing home as fast as he could, but Guilherme wouldn't make it in time. A tearful nurse came out to greet him. I'm sorry, sir. Mrs. Gonzalez died of a heart attack an hour ago. The doctors did everything they could, but sometimes even medicine is powerless. The young man felt dizzy. Guilherme took a step aside and pressed his back against the wall. He felt miserable for not even having had the chance to say goodbye to the woman who had become his mother and grandmother in one person. Tears streamed down the young man's face, but they brought him no relief. Guilherme took care of all the preparations for the funeral and wake. Worst of all was that Tiago and Bruno didn't even bother to attend Mrs. Gonzalez's funeral. After bidding farewell to the elderly woman on her final journey, Guilherme got to work. A year later, the locals learned that Guilherme had opened a free sports center for children and teenagers. Bruno and Tiago found out who gave money to Guilherme to open his center and be an honest man. Guilherme even gave them a small portion of the profits from the sale of the gold, a very small portion, as he knew Mrs. Gonzalo would certainly approve. The townspeople didn't even know that all of this was possible thanks to a kind and elderly lady who was now in heaven, watching with love over Guilherme and his achievement. My friends, we have reached the end of this video. If you liked it, leave your like, share it, and if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe to our channel, activate the notification bell for our notifications, and until the next video, God bless you.